Martin Rees had been playing bugle for 31 years, and he still couldn't tell you what last post meant. Not the notes. He knew the notes the way he knew his own heartbeat, without thinking, without trying, the way your lungs know to keep going while you sleep. He meant the meaning, the actual meaning, where it came from, why those particular notes, why that particular silence afterward, why grown men who had survived things that would break most people in half stood completely still and let their faces do whatever their faces needed to do. He'd looked it up once, read 3 different books about it, got 3 different answers. One said it was a signal from the English Civil War, a bugler's call to tell sentries the night patrol had checked the perimeter and everything was secure. Last post checked. All present. You can rest now. One said that was completely wrong, and it came from the Dutch military tradition. A tavern closing call, tapto, telling soldiers to stop drinking and return to barracks. One said both of those theories were probably half true, and mostly beside the point. Martin had decided the 3rd book was the most honest and left it there. He drove to the Tower of London on a Tuesday morning in late October with a thermos of tea that had gone cold somewhere around the Blackwall Tunnel, and a bugle in a case on the back seat that was older than his marriage, older than his children, older than most of the buildings he'd ever been billeted in. The case had a sticker on it from a service station in Aldershot that he kept meaning to remove and never did. It was 5:47 in the morning, still dark. The Thames was doing that thing it does in autumn where it looks less like water and more like something that hasn't decided what it is yet, flat and gray and slightly dangerous looking. He parked in a spot he wasn't technically supposed to park in and had been parking in for 11 years, and nobody had ever said anything. He got out, got the bugle, locked the car, and stood for a moment looking at the tower. 31 years, and it still did something to him. He couldn't tell you what exactly. He tried explaining it to his wife Janet once, and she'd said it sounded like the feeling you get walking into a very old church, and he'd said yes, something like that, except louder somehow despite the silence. She'd looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when he said things like that and gone back to her book. He walked toward the gate. There were 3 young soldiers inside the outer ward, standing near a portable heater that wasn't doing much. 2 of them were in their early 20s. One looked about 17, although Martin knew from experience that was just what 20 looked like now, and said something uncomfortable about time passing. The youngest-looking one, his name tape said Price, was holding a paper cup of something hot and staring at his phone. The other 2, Davies and a red-headed lad whose name Martin didn't catch, were having a conversation that stopped when Martin walked in. "Sergeant Rees," said Davies. Not a question, just a confirmation, like he'd been told to expect someone and was ticking a box. "Martin's fine," said Martin. He'd been out long enough that Sergeant felt like wearing someone else's coat. "You lot been here long?" "Since 4, said Price, without looking up from his phone. "What are you looking at?" "Same thing you probably got told about." Price turned the phone around. It was a PDF. Martin could see the MOD crest at the top and several paragraphs of the kind of language that meant someone in an office had made a decision that would affect people nowhere near that office. Martin took the phone, read the relevant paragraph, handed it back. "When did this come out?" he said. "Last week," said Price. "Someone in our intake group sent it round." "Has anyone official said anything to you about it?" "No." "Has anyone official said anything to anyone, far as you know?" Price looked at Davies. Davies looked at the red-headed lad. Nobody said anything. Martin nodded slowly the way you nod when the answer is the silence itself. The memo, and it was only a memo, not a directive, not a policy, not anything with teeth yet, proposed that for smaller ceremonial occasions, specifically those with fewer than 200 attendees at locations outside London, the playing of Last Post by a live bugler could be replaced by a high-quality digital audio recording played through a portable speaker system. The language was careful, could be replaced. Not would be, not must be. Just could be, which in MOD language meant someone was testing the temperature of the water before deciding whether to get in. The justification was logistical. Buglers were a finite resource. Training pipelines were long. Demand for ceremonial duties at the smaller end, village war memorials, regimental dinners, local remembrance events had actually increased in recent years, and the supply of trained buglers had not kept pace. A recording would be consistent. A recording would never be late, never be ill, never hit a bad note because it was cold and his lips weren't cooperating. All of that was true. Martin knew it was true. That was the part that made the memo hard to simply dismiss. "Do you know what last post is?" he asked Price, not aggressively, genuinely. Price looked up from his phone. "The bugle thing." "Right, do you know what it means, where it comes from?" "End of day thing, isn't it, like stand down?" "Roughly," said Martin. "Davies." Davies thought about it. "Something to do with the Civil War." "Maybe," said Martin. "Nobody fully agrees." The red-headed lad, who had been quiet until now, said, "My nan always said it meant the soldier had done his duty and was allowed home." Everyone looked at him. "Don't know if that's right," he added. "That's just what she said." Martin looked at him for a moment. "What's your name, son?" "Griffiths." "Where's your nan from?" "Pontypridd." Martin nodded. "I'm playing in Treorchy on Sunday," he said, "just down the road from there." Griffiths nodded. Neither of them said anything else. The heater hummed. The Thames moved in the dark outside the walls and didn't tell them anything one way or the other. The thing about last post that nobody explains until you are actually learning to play it is that the notes are not the difficult part. The notes are 8. There are arguments about this. Some versions have slight variations. Some regimental traditions add a grace note here or there. But the core of it is 8 notes, a simple descending and ascending phrase that any competent brass player could learn in an afternoon. Martin had learned it in about 40 minutes when he was 19 years old, standing in a practice room in Catterick that smelled of oil and old carpet, with a corporal named Henderson watching him from a plastic chair, with the expression of a man whose standards were non-negotiable but whose patience was, on that particular afternoon, available. The notes were not the point. The point, and Henderson had explained this badly at the time, Martin only understood it properly years later, was the silence. Last post is structured around what comes after it. You play the call. You hold the final note for exactly the duration your breath allows, not a moment shorter, not a forced extension either, just the natural end of the breath. And then you bring the bugle down, and then you do not move, and then the silence begins. And the silence is not empty. That was the thing. The silence is where the whole weight of the ceremony lives. It is 60 seconds at a formal remembrance, timed, exact, but even at smaller events the convention holds. You finish, you stand still, and you let the silence do what the notes cannot. Martin had played at funerals where the silence after last post was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. He'd played at a funeral in Germany in 2003, a private ceremony, a young soldier, and in the silence after the last note a woman, the soldier's mother, he found out afterward, made a sound that he had never found words for and did not try to. It was not crying exactly. It was something older than crying. He'd thought about that sound many times in the years since. He thought about what a speaker playing a digital file would do with that silence. The file would end. The silence would begin. It would probably feel the same to anyone who hadn't experienced both. That was the problem. You can't explain the difference between a live human being standing in front of you, having breathed that breath, having put themselves physically into the moment, and a recording of a human being doing the same thing unless you have stood in both silences. The difference is not in the notes. The difference is in the weight of presence. The fact that someone chose to be there. The fact that something could go wrong and didn't. The fact that the cold is real and the breath is real. and the hands on the bugle are cold and real, and shaking slightly not from nerves but from temperature and the body compensating. None of that was in the memo. Martin drove from London to South Wales on the Saturday, which took him 3 hours and 40 minutes because of roadworks near the second Severn crossing, and arrived in Treorchy in the early evening, when the light was doing exactly what autumn light in the South Wales valleys does, which is come down between the hillsides at an angle that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and slightly sorrowful, like a photograph of something you remember but can't quite place. He'd been here once before, years ago, for a different ceremony. He remembered the main street, the male voice choir connection, Treorchy Male Choir, famous enough that people who knew nothing else about the Rhondda Valley knew about them. He remembered the way the town sat in the valley like something cupped in 2 hands. He checked into a guest house on the main street, run by a woman named Carol, who immediately gave him a plate of sandwiches he hadn't asked for, and told him the heating worked fine, as long as you didn't touch the dial on the left. He didn't touch the dial on the left. The Remembrance Sunday organizer for the Treorchy War Memorial was a retired school teacher named Gwen Prosser. She was 71 years old, 5 feet 2, and operated with the calm, non-negotiable efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing rooms full of people who didn't want to be managed. She met Martin outside the memorial at 9 in the morning on Sunday for what she called a quick run-through, which took 45 minutes. The memorial itself was a standard Welsh Valley War memorial, pale stone, names in columns, a low wall around it, a small iron gate. The names on it ran from 1914 to 1918, then resumed in 1939, then a smaller cluster from Korea, one name from the Falklands. Martin had looked at memorials like this his whole adult life, and the columns of names still made him stop and recalibrate. "How many attending today?" he asked Gwen. "Confirmed about 80, but it's always more on the day. People just turn up. I gave up trying to count years ago." She said this with a small satisfaction that suggested she considered people turning up without confirming to be, on balance, a good problem to have. "Who's laying the wreath?" Gwen gestured toward a teenager standing a short distance away, studying the names on the memorial with an intensity that seemed genuine rather than performed. He was perhaps 16, maybe 17, wearing a shirt that was slightly too big for him, and a tie that had been knotted and re-knotted a few times this morning by the look of it. "That's Owen," said Gwen. "Owen Harris. He asked to do it. Wrote a letter to the committee, actually a proper letter, asking if he could lay the wreath this year. That doesn't happen often. Usually we're chasing people." "Why did he want to?" "His great-uncle is on the memorial. He only found out last year. Some family history project at school." She paused. "He's been here every Sunday for the past month, just standing there reading the names." Martin looked at Owen Harris, who was still reading the names and had not looked up. "I'll go say hello," said Martin. He walked over. Owen looked up when he heard footsteps, the instinctive look-up of someone who's been in their own head and has suddenly remembered the external world exists. "You're the bugler," said Owen. Not a question. "Small town, Sunday morning, man with a bugle case." "Martin," said Martin, "you're laying the wreath." "Yeah," a pause. "Have you done this loads of times?" "Quite a few." "Does it?" Owen stopped, started again. "Is it weird, playing it, I mean? Does it feel weird to you still, or does it just feel normal now?" Martin thought about this, with the seriousness the question deserved, rather than the deflection it would have been easy to offer. "Both at the same time," he said, "every time." Owen nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected, and was relieved to hear confirmed. "Do you know what the call actually means?" said Martin, partly out of habit now, partly because he was collecting answers. Owen looked at the memorial for a moment. "Mrs. Prosser told me it means the duty is done. Like, you've done your watch and now you can rest." Martin said nothing. "Is that right?" said Owen. "It's as right as anything else I've heard," said Martin. The third person Martin needed to know about was not someone Gwen had briefed him on or pointed out. He noticed him on his own, standing near the low wall of the memorial when the small crowd began to gather at 10:30, before the service started. He was very old, not old in the way that people say when they mean 70 or 75. Old in the way that means the body has been negotiating with time for a very long time and is still here through a combination of stubbornness and possibly sheer bloody-mindedness. He was wearing a suit that had been worn for formal occasions for at least 40 years, well kept, slightly too large now in the shoulders in the way that suits become when the person inside them has reduced slightly. He had a single medal on his lapel. Martin asked Gwen who he was. "That's Mr. Idris Thomas," she said, with a tone that suggested this was like asking who the memorial itself was. "How long has he been coming?" Gwen thought. "He was here the first year I organized it, which was 1987, but he told me once he'd been coming since 1959, so..." She looked at him briefly. 65 years roughly. "Does he have family on the memorial?" "Brother," said Gwen, "died in Korea. He was 19. Martin looked at Idris Thomas, who was standing quite still near the wall, not talking to anyone, not looking at his phone because he did not have a phone, just standing and looking at the memorial in the way that some people look at things they have been looking at for so long that looking has become a different verb for them than it is for everyone else. Martin went and stood near him, not next to him, not intrusively, just near. After a moment, Idris Thomas said, without looking at him, "You're playing today." "Yes." "Good," said Idris Thomas, "then nothing else." Martin stood with him for a while in the mid-morning cold, with the valley sides rising on both sides of the town and the light coming down at that angle, and the crowd slowly gathering, people arriving in ones and twos and small family clusters, a few in uniform, most not, a woman pushing a pram, two men who were clearly brothers from the way they stood, a group of older women from what was probably the same church committee, children who weren't entirely sure what was happening, but understood from the adult stillness around them that this was one of those occasions when you match the room's energy rather than your own. Owen Harris's tie had been reknotted again. It was better this time. At 11 o'clock, Gwen Prosser stood at the front of the small crowd with a poise that suggested she had given considerably more nerve-wracking presentations than this one, and said a few words about the memorial, about the names on it, about why they were here. Her voice carried clearly. She did not use notes. A local vicar said a short prayer. Owen Harris walked forward with the wreath and laid it at the base of the memorial. He stepped back and stood straight. His hands, Martin noticed, were very slightly shaking, the way hands shake when you care enormously about getting something right. Then it was Martin. He had moved to the position he'd scouted with Gwen that morning, slightly elevated on the low wall to the side of the memorial, so the sound could carry, facing the crowd, facing the valley. He raised the bugle. Here is what last post sounds like when it is played correctly by a human being in a small Welsh town on a cold Sunday morning in November, with 80-something people standing in silence, and a very old man near the front who has been coming here for 65 years. The first note is a middle G. It is not tentative and it is not aggressive. It is simply there, placed into the air with the full weight of the breath behind it, the way you play something down carefully because it matters, not because it is fragile. The phrase descends. There are intervals in the call that feel like questions, not musical questions exactly, not in the technical sense, but something that functions like asking, like an inquiry directed at something that doesn't answer in words. The final note is the long one. A low C. Martin held it for the length of his breath, which on a cold morning after a drive from London and a night in a guest house with a heating dial he wasn't allowed to touch, was not the longest breath of his life but was adequate, was present, was real. You could hear, if you were standing close enough. that it was a breath that had been taken by a specific person and was now being given back to the air. That is not a thing a recording can replicate. A recording is a breath that has already been given back. What you get from a speaker is the record of a gift, not the gift. He brought the bugle down. The silence began. This was the silence that was 60 seconds at a formal remembrance and no particular measured duration at a smaller one, but no shorter in feeling, possibly longer. The crowd was very still. The valley around them was doing what valleys do, which is hold sound and then release it slowly, so that the last note seemed to linger slightly in the hills, a diminishing echo that might have been real or might have been what the silence does to the ear when it expects sound and gets only continuation. Owen Harris was standing completely still with his hands clasped in front of him. His face was doing what faces do in those moments when the public and private are occupying the same expression at the same time. Idris Thomas, near the front, had closed his eyes. Martin stood with the bugle at his side and did not move. 60 seconds in complete community silence in an outdoor space is much longer than 60 seconds anywhere else. There is a quality to it that is hard to describe without sounding like you're reaching for something. It is not comfortable and it is not uncomfortable. It is simply full. The way a room is full when the right number of people are in it for the right reason. Not crowded. Full. And then it ended. The way those silences always end, not with a signal, not with a word, but with a collective sense distributed across 80 people who don't know each other particularly well, that the 60 seconds had been honored. A slight movement, a breath released, someone shifted their weight, and the world came back in carefully, not rudely. Gwen said a few final words. The vicar said something brief, and then it was over in the way that ceremonies are over completely, and then immediately complicated by the fact of continuing to exist in time afterward. People disperse slowly. That is the pattern at these events. Nobody rushes away. There is a period, 10 minutes, 15, where people stand in small groups and talk quietly, where the ordinary world reasserts itself gradually rather than all at once, like a tide coming in rather than a wave. Martin packed the bugle into its case with the Aldershot sticker he kept meaning to remove. Owen Harris appeared at his elbow. That was, he stopped. "Yeah," said Martin. "I don't know what I expected," said Owen. "I've seen it on YouTube, but it's another stop." "Different," said Martin. "Why?" said Owen. And he was asking genuinely, not rhetorically. He actually wanted to know. Martin thought about it. He thought about the memo on Price's phone at the Tower of London, the careful language, could be replaced, and the reasoning behind it that he couldn't entirely refute. He thought about Henderson in the practice room in Catterick telling him the notes were not the point. He thought about the woman at the funeral in Germany in 2003 and the sound she made in the silence. "I don't know how to explain it exactly," he said. "When a person is standing in front of you doing something, there's a weight to it because they're there, because they chose to be there, because something could go wrong and hasn't, because the cold is real and the breath is real. You can feel all of that even if you can't see it." He paused. "A recording doesn't have any of that. It's the same notes, but the notes aren't the point." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, Mrs. Prosser said the same kind of thing. She said a recording would be like a photograph of someone holding your hand. Martin looked at Gwen Prosser across the dispersing crowd, who was talking to the vicar, and did not see him looking. "That's better than how I put it," he said. Owen Harris went to find his parents. Martin closed the bugle case. Idris Thomas was still near the wall of the memorial. He hadn't moved toward the dispersing crowd. Martin walked over. Up close, the age was more specific. The hands on the top of his walking stick were the hands of someone who had been using his hands for a very long time, for work, for holding things, for the ordinary physical grammar of a long life. His eyes, when he turned to look at Martin, were clear and direct, and carried the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to look at things without expectation and without rush. "Well done," said Idris Thomas. "Thank you," said Martin. A pause. "My brother's name is on there," said Idris Thomas. Not explaining, not seeking sympathy, just stating. "The way you state coordinates, this is where the thing is." "I know," said Martin. "Gwen told me." Idris nodded. "I was 15 when he went. He was 19 when he," a pause so brief it might have been just a breath. "He wrote home and said Korea was cold. That was the main thing in the letters, how cold it was." Martin said nothing. There was nothing to say that was better than saying nothing. "I come every year," said Idris. "People ask me sometimes if it gets," he searched for the word. "Easier is what they usually say. Does it get easier?" "Does it?" said Martin. Idris Thomas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "It gets different," he said. "Every year it's a bit different because I'm different, because the town is different, because the people standing here are different." He looked at the memorial. "The names don't change, that's the thing. Everything else changes and the names don't change. And so you come and the names are still there. And that's," he stopped. "That's enough," said Martin. Idris Thomas looked at him. "Yes," he said, "that's enough." They stood together for a moment. The crowd had thinned to a handful of people. Gwen was folding a piece of paper and putting it in her bag with the finality of someone who has completed a thing they will begin preparing for again in about 3 weeks. Owen Harris was with his parents, his mother's hand briefly on his shoulder. The valley held the morning light, and then the clouds shifted slightly and it didn't. "Will you come next year?" said Idris Thomas. Martin thought about the memo, the careful language, the finite resource problem, the training pipeline, the portable speaker system and its consistency and its inability to be late or ill or to have cold hands. "I intend to," he said. Idris Thomas nodded once. "Good," he said, the same word he'd said that morning when Martin arrived. Good as a complete sentence. Good as a position. Good as a thing that was true and didn't require elaboration. He turned and walked slowly toward the gate. Martin watched him go. The memo was still live. Martin checked when he got back to Carol's guest house, sitting on the bed with a cup of tea that was actually hot this time, the heating doing its one permissible thing. He'd sent an email before leaving London to the relevant desk, politely, asking about the status of the proposal. He'd received an acknowledgement and nothing further. That was 3 weeks ago. The proposal had not been formally adopted. It had not been formally withdrawn. It was sitting in the space that memos sit in when the people responsible for them have not yet decided whether the temperature of the water is right. Someone in an office was waiting. For what exactly was unclear. For pushback, perhaps. For evidence. For someone to make the case in terms the memo could understand. Martin was not sure the case could be made in those terms. That was the problem. He could not put into a counter-memo what Idris Thomas looked like standing near the wall of the memorial in his 40-year suit. He could not attach as an appendix the sound Owen Harris had not made when the notes ended, and the silence started, the held breath, the specific quality of stillness in a 17-year-old who was standing in front of his great-uncle's name for the first time on Remembrance Sunday. He could not quantify the 60 seconds of silence in a Welsh valley with the echo moving in the hillsides, or explain in bullet points why that silence required a live human being at one end of it and not a speaker. The memo spoke in the language of logistics. Buglers were a finite resource. Demand had increased. Consistency was valuable. Cost efficiency was a real consideration in a stretched budget environment. All of that was true. And all of it missed the point by exactly the distance between a recording and a breath. He drove home on Sunday evening. The Severn was dark this time, the bridge lit up against it, the crossing from Wales to England that he had made dozens of times without it feeling like much. Janet was in the kitchen when he got in, asked if it had gone all right, and he said yes, it had gone all right. She looked at him for a moment the way she looked at him, when she knew there was more than the summary. Good, all right, or she said. Important, all right, he said. She nodded and handed him a cup of tea and went back to the thing she was doing, which was the right response and the one he needed. He didn't hear anything official about the memo for another 6 weeks. When the response came, it was not dramatic. It was an email, 3 paragraphs, addressed to the group of people who had submitted concerns. The proposal, it said, had been reviewed. The decision had been made to maintain the existing practice of live buglers for all ceremonial occasions where a trained bugler could be made available. For occasions where no trained bugler was available, a smaller category than the memo had implied, the review had found a recording could be used as a last resort, but this was to be considered a logistical contingency rather than a policy preference. 3 paragraphs. No fanfare, no acknowledgement of the specific argument, just a quiet reversal in the language of administration. Martin read it twice, forwarded it to a few people, closed his laptop. He wasn't sure what had changed the thinking. He didn't know if his email had made any difference, or the emails of the dozen other people who'd written in, or whether someone senior had attended a remembrance ceremony somewhere and stood in the silence and understood something that couldn't be written in a memo but could apparently be felt in a field or a town square or a valley on a November morning. He didn't know and he didn't find out. That is how these things usually work. The decision arrives without a full account of its reasoning. The thing that was threatened continues. Nobody makes a speech about it. Martin played at Treorchy again the next November. Gwen Prosser was there in the same organizational capacity, the same quiet command, the same couple of preparatory conversations that felt like briefings. The crowd was slightly larger. Word had got around, she said, the way it does when something is done properly. Owen Harris was there. He was 18 now, a few inches taller, and he laid the wreath again. He'd asked to. Written another letter to the committee, a proper letter. Gwen had told Martin this over the phone in October with a satisfaction in her voice that she didn't try to conceal. Martin asked Owen, before the ceremony, if he'd figured out what last post meant yet. Owen thought about it. I think it means you're still here, he said. Like the person is gone, but the call means the person standing there is still here. And they're saying that out loud. That's the point. Martin looked at him. Where did you get that from? I sort of worked it out, said Owen, from thinking about it. Martin nodded slowly. That might be the best answer I've heard, he said. Owen Harris shrugged with the modesty of someone who isn't sure if they've said something profound or just got lucky. I still don't really know, he said. Nobody does, said Martin. That might be part of it. Idris Thomas was at the wall again. Same suit, same metal, same stillness. Martin went and stood near him before the service. You're back, said Idris Thomas. I said I would be, said Martin. Idris nodded. He didn't say good this time. He didn't need to. They stood together in the morning cold, the valley holding itself around them, the names on the memorial doing what the names did, which was stay, which was the one thing they could do and the most important thing, and also, in the end, enough. Martin raised the bugle when the time came. The first note went into the cold air. It was the same call it had always been. 8 notes, more or less, depending on who you asked and which book you'd read. A signal from somewhere in history that nobody could entirely trace, carrying a meaning that nobody could entirely agree on, played by a person standing in a specific place on a specific morning in a Welsh valley, breathing the actual air, feeling the actual cold, present in the only way that presence is possible, which is completely in the moment, with no recording standing in for the fact of being there. The final note held. Then the silence. Then the valley. Then Idris Thomas with his eyes closed and Owen Harris with his hands clasped, and 80-something people who had turned up without confirming, and the names that didn't change, and the morning that would end, and the year that would turn, and November coming round again the way it always did, reliably, without being asked. Martin brought the bugle down. The silence did the rest. The memo was never officially withdrawn. It was simply not acted upon. The following year, the same proposal was raised again in slightly different language and was again not formally adopted. Somewhere in the Ministry of Defense, a file sits in this state, neither resolved nor abandoned, which is, in the language of institutions, the closest thing to a permanent answer that tradition is usually given. Idris Thomas attended the Triorci Remembrance Service for the 67th consecutive year. He does not know about the memo. Nobody told him. Owen Harris is currently considering applying to the Army. Martin Rees still has the sticker on the bugle case.